Let me tell you the exact second Indiana Fever lost Saturday's game. Not the fourth quarter. Not the third quarter when Portland went nuclear and dropped 37 points on them. The game was lost at 6 minutes and 30 seconds into the first quarter. One substitution. 2 players removed. That's it. And I'm going to show you exactly why that single decision broke this team's back, why what Stephanie White said about it at the press conference is actually more damaging than the decision itself, and why the Indiana Fever front office can no longer look away from what the evidence is telling them. We're going floor to podium today. Let's go. Indiana Fever came out Saturday, playing like the team this roster is genuinely capable of being. They were pushing pace, moving the ball, executing. Within the opening minutes, they had built an 8-2 lead against the Portland Fire, the same Portland Fire that embarrassed them by 16 points in the previous meeting. Think about what that means in context. The Fever had gone back, identified what went wrong in Game 1, built a corrected approach, and were executing it at a high level on a live floor against a team that had already beaten them. The momentum was measurable, and it was pointing one direction. Indiana's direction. Portland looked disorganized, disrupted, and uncomfortable against Indiana's energy. Everything was working. Then Stephanie White made a substitution. At the 6-minute 30-second mark of the first quarter, with the Fever leading 8-2, with Caitlin Clark having already recorded 3 assists in the first 3 minutes of the game, White removed Clark and Aaliyah Boston from the floor at the same time. Both of them simultaneously. The primary offensive engine and the primary defensive anchor. Gone. Together. While the team was winning. While the momentum was completely theirs. While Portland was the team that looked lost. What happened next is now permanent film record. Portland went on a 13-2 run. The lead didn't just disappear, it reversed. The entire competitive architecture of that game shifted in those minutes. The momentum, the defensive posture, the offensive rhythm, the energy inside that building, all of it flipped and none of it came back to Indiana for the rest of the game. Final score 84-100. Portland Fire win. And the Fever could not catch up from that moment forward. The gas was gone. The window had closed. And it closed at the 6:30 mark of the first quarter when a coaching decision killed the only momentum this team had generated. The precise analytical question that substitution demands is this. What information did Stephanie White possess at that specific moment that made removing both primary offensive and defensive anchors the correct decision? The team was producing. The opponent was struggling. The lead was growing. What did the live game tell her that justified pulling both of them at the same time? That is the question reporter Chloe Peterson asked at the post-game press conference, and she asked it with complete factual accuracy. Fever started 8-2, Clark and Boston came out at 6:30, Portland went on a 13-2 run. What was the reasoning? White gave 2 explanations. The first was that Aaliyah Boston is on a minutes restriction. That is a legitimate medically grounded rationale. A player under a minutes restriction has a defined availability window, and decisions about when within a game to use those minutes involve medical staff input. We are not arguing with that part. Boston coming out has a defensible explanation on its own terms. But the second explanation is the one that the film record makes completely indefensible. White stated on the record, and I'm quoting directly, typically that is around the same time that we have been taking Caitlin out. Typically. Around the same time that we have been taking Caitlin out. Read that slowly. The stated rationale for removing the best player on your roster during an 8-2 run in the first quarter of a game against a team that beat you by 16 in the previous meeting was not a situational read. It was not a response to what the live game was communicating. It was a pre-scripted rotation clock. A timing pattern established across prior games that the coaching staff was applying to this game regardless of what the actual competitive state of this specific game was telling them. The Fever were winning. They were executing. Clark was producing. And the reason she came off the floor is because the clock said it was time. That is the definition of mechanical script following. And in professional basketball, it is one of the most fundamental coaching failures that exists because it means the pre-game plan is outranking the live game in the decision-making hierarchy. That is backwards. That has always been backwards. Every coach who has ever won anything at the highest level understands that the pre-game plan is the secondary document and the live game is the primary one. The plan exists to be overridden when the game tells you to override it. When your best player is producing, when the momentum is yours, when the opponent is disrupted, the rotation clock does not matter. What matters is the scoreboard. What matters is the competitive state of the game in front of you right now. And White's own words document that the competitive state of the game was not the primary input in that decision. The clock was. This is not a single bad decision in a difficult moment. This is a documented philosophical approach to rotation management. And a philosophical approach reproduces itself. Every game where the pre-scripted timing conflicts with what the live game actually demands, this same outcome becomes structurally predictable, because the framework that produced it has not changed. The press conference raised a separate but directly connected issue when White addressed the Golden State game. She explained that she kept Clark on the floor longer in that game because Raven Johnson wasn't available, and she didn't want Clark in that hostile road environment without a second primary ball handler. The implication being that Johnson's role is being managed carefully, that certain environments are considered too challenging for her current development level. This is where the problem compounds. Raven Johnson was drafted for specific developmental reasons. Her growth as a professional is directly tied to her exposure to increasingly difficult competitive situations. A coaching philosophy that withholds a developing player from challenging environments to protect her from difficulty is not player development. It is player restriction dressed up as care. The discomfort of hostile road environments, elite defenders, high-pressure moments where mistakes carry real consequences. That discomfort is the mechanism by which professional players grow. Remove the exposure, and you remove the growth. Johnson needs those reps in those environments. Every time she sits out of a difficult situation is a developmental opportunity that is gone permanently. And the philosophy that keeps her away from that exposure, while calling it development, is the thing that actually slows her down. Now the third quarter. Portland scored 37 points in a single quarter. 37. And White's explanation for that defensive collapse pointed to slow rotations, foul trouble, and players not anticipating well enough. Players did not rotate fast enough. Players were not in the right positions. Players got in foul trouble. These descriptions may be partially accurate as accounts of what happened on the floor, but the analytical framework that examines only what players did without examining the defensive scheme design that placed them in those positions produces an explanation that is incomplete and self-serving for the coaching staff. Portland scored 37 in a quarter because they found specific coverage gaps in Indiana's defensive scheme, and they went back to those gaps over and over again. Those gaps were produced by personnel matchup decisions and scheme design, both of which are coaching responsibilities. The players who failed to rotate fast enough were rotating to cover for structural vulnerabilities that a different scheme design would not have required them to cover in the first place. Blaming player rotation speed without examining why that rotation was necessary is like telling someone they need to bail water faster without asking why the boat has a hole in it. Locate the failure in player execution without examining the scheme design that created the conditions for that failure, and you have described what happened without diagnosing why it keeps happening. The three-point shooting situation adds another layer. The Fever went 0 for 9 from 3 before Sophie Cunningham finally connected late in the second quarter. Second consecutive game with a catastrophic perimeter shooting start. White's explanation was that passes were arriving late. Balls were getting to shooters after their momentum had already peaked, forcing receivers to reach or reset before shooting. That description of the mechanical failure is accurate, but it doesn't address what produces late passes in a professional half-court system. Late passes happen because defensive positioning has taken away the primary delivery window and forced the passer into a secondary read. By the time that secondary read becomes available, the shooter's rhythm is already gone. The solution is not to simply tell passers to be faster. The solution is offensive design that creates cleaner delivery angles through movement and screening action so that the primary window is available earlier in the possession without requiring the passer to force it. The off-ball screening combinations, the pick-and-roll actions, the spacing patterns that generate the clean catch points where shooters can receive the ball in rhythm and fire immediately. Those actions were not consistently present in Indiana's half-court offense. Their absence is the upstream cause of the late pass problem. White's explanation describes the symptom. The film shows the cause. The coaching staff's job is to fix the cause, not characterize the symptom as a player execution failure. And then there is the language of the press conference itself, which is worth examining carefully because it documents something important about accountability posture. Throughout White's responses, there is a consistent pattern of collective pronouns. We are. This is our typical substitution pattern. Our approach. Our system. Every time she describes a decision that is unambiguously within the individual authority of the head coach, the language distributes that decision across a collective. A head coach holds the clipboard. A head coach makes substitution calls. When a substitution call produces a 13-2 run that determines a game's outcome, the accountability for that call belongs to the individual who made it, not to the staff, not to the system, not to the collective. Using we and our to describe individual coaching decisions is a documented accountability diffusion pattern, and it matters organizationally because it signals to everyone in the building that individual ownership of outcomes is not the standard being modeled at the top. Compare the language that should have been used. This is on me. I made that call. I read the game wrong at that moment, and I will correct it. That language costs the coach nothing in terms of credibility. It actually builds credibility because it demonstrates the self-awareness and ownership that competent leadership requires. What the press conference documented instead was a consistent choice to distribute rather than accept, to use collective framing to avoid the specific individual acknowledgement that the situation demanded. Here is where this all connects at the organizational level. The pattern across this season is now comprehensive enough to evaluate directly and honestly. The rotation management failures. The defensive accountability explanations that point at players without examining scheme design. The offensive explanations that describe symptoms without identifying structural causes. The press conference language that distributes accountability instead of accepting it. The developmental philosophy that restricts rather than exposes. The mechanical script following that overrides live game intelligence. These are not isolated incidents scattered across a difficult season. Consistent patterns in institutional behavior are the most reliable predictors of future outcomes. And the consistent pattern documented here is pointing in one direction. Amber Cox, Kelly Krossoff, and the ownership structure above them now have a documented record that is comprehensive enough to answer a direct question without projecting or speculating. Is the current coaching structure capable of maximizing what this roster can become? The evidence to answer that question already exists. It is on film. It is in the press conference transcripts. It is in the final score from Saturday night. And here is the part that makes this genuinely urgent. Caitlin Clark's career arc does not pause while that question is being deliberated. Every game played inside a structure that the evidence suggests is producing preventable, structurally predictable outcomes is a game of her generational prime that cannot be recovered. The front office's timeline for action is not defined by the regular season schedule. It is not defined by convenience or comfort or organizational inertia. It is defined by that reality. Every week of deliberation is a week that cannot be returned. The Indiana Fever have a roster capable of competing at the highest level in this league right now. The roster is not the problem. The talent is not the problem. What the documented record asks the front office to honestly evaluate is whether the people making decisions on that sideline and at that podium are capable of maximizing what this roster can become. The film says one thing. The press conference says another. And the scoreboard, as it always does, tells you everything you need to know when the final buzzer sounds.